Today, I want to ask you a question that might make you uncomfortable, might challenge you, might even inspire you. Is there a Gideon in you? To answer that question, we need to go back about 3,000 years to a time of darkness in Israel's history. The book of Judges tells us that the Israelites had done evil in the sight of the Lord, and because of their disobedience, God allowed the Midianites to oppress them for 7 years. Now, when we read oppression, we need to understand what that really meant. This wasn't just political domination. The Midianites, along with the Amalekites and other eastern peoples, would sweep through Israel like locusts at harvest time. They would camp on the land, destroy the crops, and leave nothing for Israel to eat. The Bible says they left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. Israel was impoverished, reduced to hiding in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. They were living in fear, in poverty, in desperation. Picture that for a moment. Imagine working all season long, planting your crops, tending them, watching them grow, anticipating the harvest that will feed your family through the winter. And then, just as you're about to reap what you've sown, raiders come. They take everything. They destroy what they can't carry. And there's nothing you can do about it. Year after year after year. That was Israel's reality. Into this desperate situation, we meet our protagonist. His name is Gideon, and when we first encounter him in Judges chapter 6, he is threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, if you know anything about ancient agriculture, you know that's completely backwards. Wheat was supposed to be threshed on a hilltop or open area where the wind could blow away the chaff. A winepress was down low, hidden, enclosed. Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress for one reason. He was hiding. He was afraid. He was doing everything he could to keep the Midianites from seeing him and taking the little bit of food he had managed to grow.
This is important. This is who Gideon was when God called him. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't standing on a hilltop rallying the troops. He was hiding in a hole, trying to scrape together enough food to survive another day. And then the angel of the Lord appears to him. And here's where the story gets interesting, because the angel greets him with these words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior. Can you imagine? Gideon is literally cowering in a winepress, and God calls him a mighty warrior. It's almost comical. It would be like someone finding you hiding under your desk during a crisis and saying, "Hello there, brave hero." And Gideon's response is so human, so relatable. He essentially says, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the miracles our fathers told us about? God has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." Now, I want you to notice something here. Gideon isn't full of faith at this moment. He's full of doubt. He's questioning God. He's looking at his circumstances and saying, "This doesn't look like God is with us." And yet, God doesn't rebuke him for this. God doesn't say, "How dare you question me?" Instead, the Lord turns to him and says, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Go in the strength you have. Not the strength you wish you had, not the strength someone else has, not the strength you'll have someday, the strength you have right now. God was essentially saying, "Gideon, I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm asking you to step forward as you are." But Gideon still isn't convinced. He says, "Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." This is the language of insecurity, of inadequacy, of feeling completely unqualified. Gideon saw himself as the least of the least, the bottom of the barrel, the one nobody would ever choose for anything important.
And here's what I love about this story. God didn't argue with Gideon's self-assessment. He didn't say, "No, Gideon, you're actually very strong and capable." Instead, God said, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." In other words, you're right, Gideon, you can't do this, but I can. and I will do it through you." So Gideon asked for a sign, and God graciously gave him one. Then another, the famous fleece test. Gideon put out a wool fleece and asked God to make it wet with dew while the ground around it stayed dry. God did it. Then Gideon, still uncertain, asked for the reverse, keep the fleece dry while the ground is wet, and God did that too. Some people criticize Gideon for this, but I see a God who is patient with our doubts, who understands our need for reassurance, who meets us where we are. Finally, Gideon gathered an army. 32,000 men showed up ready to fight the Midianites. Now that might sound like a lot, but the Bible tells us that the Midianite army was like locusts in number, impossible to count, with camels as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Estimates suggest they had over 100,000 warriors. So even with 32,000 men, Israel was vastly outnumbered. But then God said something shocking. "You have too many men." Too many. They were already outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, and God says they have too many? God explained, "In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, I'm going to reduce your army." So God told Gideon to announce that anyone who was afraid could go home. 22,000 men left. That's more than 2/3 of his army, gone in an instant. Gideon was left with 10,000 men. And God said, "There are still too many." God had Gideon take the men down to the water to drink, and he separated them by how they drank. Those who lapped the water with their hands to their mouths, staying alert, were kept. Those who knelt down to drink were sent home. Only 300 men remained. 300 against over 100,000. Think about that. God reduced Gideon's army by 99%, from 32,000 to 300. By any military standard, this was suicide. This was impossible. And that was exactly God's point. There was no way 300 men could defeat that massive army through conventional warfare. The victory would have to be God's, and God's alone. Now, I want you to notice something beautiful here. Even after all this, God knew Gideon was still afraid. So the night before the battle, God told Gideon, "If you're afraid to attack, go down to the enemy camp with your servant and listen to what they're saying." Gideon went, and he overheard a Midianite soldier telling his friend about a dream where a loaf of barley bread came tumbling into camp and struck a tent so hard it collapsed. The friend interpreted the dream. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash. God has given the Midianites into his hands." Even the enemy knew God was with Gideon. And when Gideon heard this, the Bible says he worshipped. His fear turned to faith. His doubt turned to confidence. Not confidence in himself, but confidence in God. So here's what Gideon did. He divided his 300 men into 3 companies. He gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside it. That's it. No swords in their hands, no shields, no armor, just trumpets and jars with torches. They surrounded the Midianite camp in the middle of the night, and at Gideon's signal, they all did 3 things simultaneously. They blew their trumpets, they smashed their jars so the torches blazed in the darkness, and they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The effect was devastating. The Midianites woke up to what seemed like a massive army surrounding them in the darkness. They heard trumpets from every direction, saw torches blazing all around them, heard the battle cry echoing through the night. In their panic and confusion, they turned on each other with their swords. The Bible says the Lord caused the men throughout the enemy camp to turn on each other with their swords. The Midianite army destroyed itself, while Gideon's 300 men just stood their ground and watched God fight for them. The victory was complete. The vast Midianite army fled, and Israel was delivered. And here's what's crucial. Everyone knew it was God who won the battle. There was no way 300 men with trumpets and jars could take credit for defeating an army of that size. God got all the glory, which was the point all along. So who was Gideon? He was a fearful man who became brave. He was a doubter who learned to trust.
He was someone who saw himself as inadequate but allowed God to work through his inadequacy. He was a man hiding in a winepress who became a deliverer of his nation. And he was someone who learned that God doesn't need our strength or our numbers or our impressive qualifications. God just needs our willingness to step forward and watch him work. Now, let's fast forward to today. Let's talk about us. Because if we're honest, most of us have more in common with Gideon in the winepress than we'd like to admit. We live in different times. We face different enemies, but the internal struggle is remarkably similar. How many of us are hiding in our own wine presses? Maybe it's not Midianites we're afraid of, but it's fear nonetheless. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of what people will think, fear of stepping out and falling flat on our face. So we stay small, we stay hidden, we stay safe. How many of us, when God calls us to something, immediately respond with our inadequacies? I'm not educated enough. I'm not talented enough. I'm too young. I'm too old. I'm too broken. I have too much baggage. I don't have the right connections. I don't have the resources. My family background isn't impressive. I'm the least likely person for this job. Sound familiar? That's Gideon's voice. But here's the question we need to ask ourselves. If God could use Gideon, can God use us? The answer, my friends, is yes. Absolutely yes. But it requires something from us. It requires us to stop waiting until we feel qualified. It requires us to stop waiting until we feel brave. It requires us to go in the strength we have right now, trusting that God will make up the difference. And here's another lesson from Gideon's story. God will often reduce what we think we need before he gives us the victory. You think you need more money, more education, more time, more help, more resources? God might strip some of that away so that when the victory comes, you'll know beyond any doubt that it was him. When you succeed with less than you thought you needed, you can't take the credit. God gets the glory.
That 300-man army teaches us something profound. God plus anyone is a majority. It doesn't matter how outnumbered you feel. It doesn't matter how overwhelming your circumstances seem. If God is with you, you have everything you need. You see, the Gideon in you isn't some superhuman version of yourself that you need to become. The Gideon in you is the part of you that, despite fear and doubt and inadequacy, says yes to God anyway. The Gideon in you is the part that takes the first step even when you can't see the whole staircase. The Gideon in you is the part that's willing to stand with a trumpet and a torch and watch God do the impossible. The story of Gideon reminds us that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. He doesn't look for ability, he looks for availability. He doesn't need our strength, he offers his own. And sometimes he strips away what we think we need to show us that we only need him. So, is there a Gideon in you? I believe there is. The question is, will you let him out of the winepress? Will you stop hiding and start stepping forward? Will you go in the strength you have, trusting that God is sending you? Will you be willing to watch God reduce your resources so he can increase his glory? Will you stand with your trumpet and your torch and watch him win the battle? The world needs people who will answer that call. Not perfect people, not super confident people, not people with unlimited resources, just willing people. People who say, "Here I am, Lord, use me, inadequacies and all. Give me my trumpet and my torch, and I'll watch you work." That's the Gideon in you. And it's time to let that Gideon rise.